Caitlin Clark forfeits her position in first class. Then something unusual for a veteran occurs when the famous Caitlin Clark basketball player renowned for her modesty gave her up on and off the court. Seat in first class for an elderly veteran. Nobody had foreseen the astonishing relationship that would develop. What transpired next in midair left the cabin lights left the guests stunned. Dimly flickered when the passengers sat down. A mixture of pre-flight information into their seats, turmoil, and a sense of anticipation permeating the It had been a clear morning at Ronald Reagan National Airport in Washington, and the Newark Flight 247 was completely booked. Caitlin Clark was dressed casually in a satin sneakers and a sweatshirt. She was wearing headphones in the first class, and she had a book open and seemed at ease. Wishing to stay out of the spotlight, even though they are immediately identifiable to admirers of basketball on the other side of the aisle in the economy sector, a senior citizen he shuffled to his place in the late 1970s. His silver hair was brushed beautifully, and he held a worn-out leather duffel bag that his military jacket had faded. Ribbons and patches that subtly convey years of service and sacrifice. Passengers conversed in silence. Looks as he went by, several appreciative the silent dignity with which he walked. Eventually, he took a seat next to the plane's rear, stuck between an entrepreneur absorbed on his laptop and a flight attendant with a restless toddler. Hurried along the aisles to make sure all of them were sitting and that the carry-on bags were stored correctly. A ripple appeared as the cabin doors closed. When stress flowed through the atmosphere, the man sitting beside the veteran appeared to clearly distressed and whining about wanting additional room. In spite of the veterans, after several apologies, the uproar increased, loudly attracting Caitlin's attention, who had looked up while absorbed in her book. She could see from her vantage point the scenario taking place close to the rear of the plane. The old man, clearly uncomfortable, was attempting to defuse the situation. With a troubled brow, Caitlin leaned toward the aisle, watching for a short while. Prior to reaching a judgment, without hesitation, she hit the call button. Caitlin saw a flight attendant come. "Excuse me, but I spoke with calm authority. Could I take the gentleman's seat instead?" The attendant, wearing the military jacket, blinked briefly, taken aback. First-class passengers looked up from their tablets and newspapers, intrigued by the surprising request. Caitlin's face made no allowances for disagreement. Her calm but gentle tone allowed me to verify the attendant's voice response. With a hint of astonishment, she hurriedly walked down the hallway to the senior citizens. Caitlin was sat next to the veteran, stood up and picked up her carry-on bag. Across the aisle, a woman leaned, excessively perplexed. "You don't have to do that," she said. "You." Caitlin, who paid for the seat, shrugged and grinned, because some individuals deserved it. The first-class muttering increased, louder as travelers looked at one another. Shortly after, the flight attendant looked back at her with admiration. He stated that he would be pleased to exchange. Caitlin was told, nodding, and she grabbed her suitcase and headed down the short path. As she went by, passengers in the aisle muttered, some discreetly taking pictures of Caitlin's, but attention was still on the man in the when Caitlin arrived at his military jacket. The old veteran looked up on the seat. "Are you certain about this?" His voice was tinted with both when he asked appreciation, as well as "I'm sure." Caitlin responded in disbelief. She held out her hand and said, "Thank you for your service. Kindly take my place." Veteran paused for a second before locking eyes with Caitlin's, as though looking for some hint of dishonesty, but the resolve in her eyes were unmistakable, and he stood slowly, tightly holding her hand as he said, "Thank you very much, Mississippi. That's quite nice of you." When the veteran started to make his direction of the aircraft's front, admiration-filled whispers swept through. A young mother in row 15 of the cabin muttered, "Did you see?" to her adolescent son, that she forfeited her spot in first class. Caitlin slid into the economy, which was now empty. Carefully slipping her long legs into her seat into the small area, she appeared disregarding the discomfort, returning to her book, and losing oneself in the businessman sitting next to the pages. She looked over and said, "Never seen, Caitlin, anything like that on a plane." Just grinned and went back to her. While reading, in first class, the veteran slid into Caitlin's seat. He clearly adjusted the soft armrest. Overtaken by the surprising gesture, a flight attendant came over with a drink and a blanket. The young woman said, She clarified that you ought to have the seat. The veteran nodded, his voice softly. His response was no more than a whisper. I haven't been treated in years. Similar to when the economy recovered, Caitlin stayed not aware of the increasing buzz about her deed of generosity made the passengers shiver. Around their necks to get a look at her, their quiet murmurs, a combination of a flight of admiration and curiosity. A discreet attendant came up to her. Miss Clark, is there anything you need? Caitlin shook her head when questioned, providing a courteous smile. No thanks, I'm ready. As the aircraft arrived at cruising altitude, the cabin was filled with the gentle hum of the engines. The veteran sipped his drink in silence, gazing out of the window while drinking water, his hands on his lap. During a prolonged, he paused and looked at the seated passenger, a middle-aged woman beside him with courteous eyes. I must speak. Started speaking to the woman in a steady yet low voice. She cocked her head in curiosity. Naturally, the veteran made the minor. He groaned and put a purple love pin on his lapel. That young lady who handed me this touched my heart. My life was transformed by her family. After the woman blinked, surprised. What do you think? Meaning that the veteran reclined in his chair. His face became wistful as he started telling his story decades ago. I returned during the Gulf War, stateside following an injury, without nowhere to go and no family to talk about. Found myself in Iowa attempting to reconstruct my one day in my life. I was sitting outside, I'm not sure where I'll get my next meal. Originate from a man who paused and inquired if I was all right. Caitlin Clark's boyfriend. The woman's eyes widened. Granddad. Expression that combines amazement and surprise. Her. The veteran granddad nodded his head. He didn't just hand me his developing strength. He changed and left after sitting with me, heard my tale, and ensured that I had. He even assisted me in getting a roof over my head. Locate a job that he never requested. He just said, you've served great nation, and we are grateful to you for that. By now, I've never forgotten their words. The veteran's tale had captured the several passengers' attention in the first class. Their interest is evolving into the woman. Next him bent in admiration. Her countenance softens as she gets closer. She said, that's amazing. And today his granddaughter Caitlin Clark handed you. It feels like life has arrived in her seat. Circle. The veteran gave a slight smile and nodded, pulling at the edges of his mouth. I always wanted to express gratitude to her family, but I never had the opportunity. Life goes on, and I believed that moment would never come again, but he now trailed off, looking in the direction of the Caitlin sat in the economy section. Silently unaware of the ripples presence activities had caused the discussion to start spreading. One man was sat across from the other passengers. The man in the aisle looked to be in his 40s. I apologize for interrupting, but you're my father served, and this story struck close to home. Throughout the first Gulf War, and he consistently stated the same thing, that even the tiniest actions of the most significant difference was kindness. Upon arriving home, the veteran looked to. Next him bent in admiration. Her countenance softens as she gets closer. She said, that's amazing. And today his granddaughter Caitlin Clark handed you. It feels like life has arrived in her seat. Circle. The veteran gave a slight smile and nodded, pulling at the edges of his mouth. I always wanted to express gratitude to her family, but I never had the opportunity. Life goes on, and I believed that moment would never come again, but he now trailed off, looking in the direction of the Caitlin sat in the economy section. Silently unaware of the ripples presence activities had caused the discussion to start spreading. One man was sat across from the other passengers. The man in the aisle looked to be in his 40s. I apologize for interrupting, but you're my father served, and this story struck close to home. Throughout the first Gulf War, and he consistently stated the same thing, that even the tiniest actions of the most significant difference was kindness. Upon arriving home, the veteran looked to. It's true that he softened his features. Responded at the time, I believed my life was over, but someone showed concern. And that's what altered everything. Caitlin Clark made me think of whispers turned across the cabin today. Into a mother's shared reflections, her toddler, who was sleeping, whispered to the man. In addition, her generosity isn't Caitlin's something you see every day gesture merely demonstrates that minor acts actually has the ability to alter the world. In the meantime, Caitlin observed the occasionally. She received glances, but kept reading her book without being influenced by. She was unaware of the attention that growing rumors about first class or the significant effect that her straightforward choice had caused a flight attendant to come up to her once more, bending slightly. "This time to please excuse me, Miss Clark, and meet her eye level." "I thought you," the attendant remarked softly, "ought to be aware of the man you handed your take a seat and simply tell a fantastic story." Caitlin sought up information on your family from her book, her forehead slightly furrowed, and "My family was curious," so she asked in a curious voice. The attendant nodded, calm yet fascinated. "He informed us that many years ago, your grandfather assisted him during the Gulf War, gave him when he was at his lowest, a job and a place to live when he had nothing, yet he mentions your gesture today. Made things complete." Caitlin blinked briefly, surprised that she gently shut her book. Let the knowledge sink in." "I had no idea." She whispered. Her voice tinted. Caitlin sat in silence, filled with passion, for she took a time to consider what she had just discovered. The flight attendant extended an offer to her, a tiny grin before getting up and leaving Caitlin with her as she leaves thoughts. She looked in the direction of the old veteran's seat on the aircraft, now having a lengthy discussion with the people nearby. The uncomplicated deed of, in some way, compassion had revealed a tale she was unaware of her existence. Grandpa, a tale that now seems incredibly intimate. As the aircraft started to descend, the veteran got up from his chair first. Lesson, much to everyone's astonishment, observing him walk down the aisle, targeting passengers in the budget section swiveled to follow his motions. Their interest reached a crescendo when he got to Caitlin's row. He paused and gave her a hard, worn hand, and "I simply intended to express gratitude," he stated. "Your actions today were solid but emotive. This seat wasn't the only thing that was about bringing to my attention something I'll remember, how your family assisted me reconstruct my life, and you have honored me today." Caitlin Legacy shook his hand. "Statement of gratitude that is both sincere and modest. I didn't use your service," she said quietly. "I am aware of my grandfather's generosity, yet I'm happy I was able to continue." The veteran gave you a nod, his eyes sparkling. "Much more than just keep it going. You demonstrated that the principles he upheld are you never lose, that you're alive and well." Passengers in the vicinity had become quiet. About all of the focus was on the sincere conversation, in which some people shed tears their eyes, while others provided silence. Admiring smiles as the veteran made as he returned to his seat. A wave of a round of applause began, with a few claps and enlargement into a more. Caitlin was deeply embarrassed by the attention, gave a courteous smile, and went back to her book, but her thoughts were the pages she had been reading were far away. Rather, it persisted in her story, recently heard, and the surprising link when the aircraft touched down. She had made that the atmosphere aboard was unique. Many passengers on aircraft AS disembarked. Paused to give Caitlin credit for her generosity as others went to the veterans to show appreciation for his assistance. The feeling of belonging, and there was a tangible sense of mutual regard. Moment of solidarity, during which everyone appeared to. The veteran stopped one moment at the gate. "When you last spoke with Caitlin, you tip your cap," he said. "Got a good heart. Never allow the world to harden it." Caitlin grinned and spoke in a forceful yet gentle tone. "Won't." As she made her way over to the luggage assert that Caitlin took out her phone and sent her mother a brief message by text. Paused for a second before striking. "Did you know, Grandpa?" "Send the text message." Assisted a veteran following World War I in the Gulf, believe he would be pleased with the outcome. Today, as Caitlin entered the luggage claim region, she experienced a peculiar feeling of silent pride and reflection on the incidents of the flight. Had come as a surprise, but incredibly significant. She recovered her bag and started to go for the exit. The veteran's comments continued to reverberate throughout her. "Never allow the world to harden." She was leaving. A young couple who had been sitting close to her on the aircraft went up to her. "Pardon us," the woman murmured nervously, clutching her partner's hand. I wanted to express my gratitude for what your actions back there were motivating." Observe someone behave in such a selflessly. Caitlin gave her a loving smile, being modest and saying, "Thank you," yet as she shook her head and said nothing. "The man deserved it more than I did." "Very nicely, it was really meaningful to you," reminded everyone on that plane. That tiny act of generosity can have a big impact. Enormous. Caitlin nodded her chest in contrast, overflowing with appreciation for what they said. "I'm just happy that it struck a chord with others." As she stepped outdoors, she stated simply, "Caitlin." Out into the cool evening air, couldn't resist thinking about how the simple choices could have an external ripple effect, establishing moments of communication, and in a world that frequently felt controversial, which she was aware would carry nor the recollection of that flight with her, not just as a private reminder, but also as a evidence of the effectiveness of empathy. Later that night, Caitlin sat by herself in her browsing through her phone in the hotel room. She saw that there were more and more messages. Get alerts on social media from those who were on the aircraft expressing their thoughts on what had occurred when a passenger read a post. "I saw something noteworthy on my Caitlin Clark sacrificed her maiden flight. A veterans class seat. But what stuck out, the story that stood out even more, was told a tale about her grandfather's generosity. It served as a potent reminder that little things count," Caitlin thought. Before writing a response, she took a time to lessons about kindness and thankfulness are typed. "We can all continue my grandfather's legacy. Lived by it, and I intend to follow suit. I'm grateful for so." She sent her message, and she joined the rising tide of optimism ignited by what she did in the days that followed. Caitlin's gesture became widely known, increasing conversations on kindness and admiration as headlines praised her for her modesty. But Caitlin persisted, reminding those that reached out, grounded that the story's real protagonist was in interviews. The veteran frequently stated was about realizing, "Not about me," and somebody who had contributed so much for all of us if I can remind them via my platform. People who understand the value of thankfulness and compassion, I'll regard that as a triumph. The veteran also ended up at the focus of attention while narrating his tale with media and considering the generosity that had influenced his life. In each interview, he made certain to highlight the time spent on the aircraft and how the gesture made by Caitlin had brought his voyage. That comes full circle at the story's conclusion, became more than a quick gesture of being polite while flying. Became a symbol of the benefits that might result when individuals put compassion before apathy. Caitlin's behavior, in addition to the veteran's history, brought back many memories. People that generosity leaves a lasting legacy construction, as well as for Caitlin upon her return to her typical basketball regimen, she brought that legacy with her to court. She was aware of that, whether it came from her athletic accomplishments or her daily activities, that the flight's lessons would remain by her side, helping her make decisions and encouraging others in the process.